How many of you were here last year? Oh, a few of you, yeah. Last year I talked about dragon legends worldwide, all over the world, in all different cultures, and came to the conclusion that behind these stories there's something real. You can't have a dragon just as an allegory for something or a metaphor for something without the knowledge of that creature being there in the first place. Like you can't say somebody is as brave as a lion without there being a lion to compare that to. And this year I've been asked to focus down a bit purely onto British dragons. So what I'll do in this talk is take a look briefly at the different types of British dragon and then what makes British dragon lore unique. It has strange little foibles, British dragon lore, that's different from anywhere else. And I'll have a look at some of the tricks used to defeat dragons in British dragon lore, and then bring it up to date with looking at what could have been behind these stories and some contemporary stories of dragon-like creatures seen in Britain, and tying it all in with some ritual magic that might have gone on in certain places, and even tales of human sacrifice in the 20th century by a dragon cult. So, types of British dragon. The type we're most familiar with is these here. These are the classic dragon. They're sometimes called the heraldic dragon or fire drake. They are the true dragon. Now a true dragon is a gigantic reptilian creature. They're always reptiles, they're always reptilian, and they always have 4 legs and 2 wings. One of the things that makes me blind with rage, apart from the Conservative Party, who do make me blind with rage, is the way that Hollywood depicts dragons as only having 2 legs and 2 wings, which is completely wrong. The true dragon, the true Western dragon, will always have 4 legs and 2 wings. They generally breathe fire. They're covered with armour-plated skin. They're virtually impossible to kill. If you look at the very early legends of dragons, they're essentially gods. Right, they're closer to gods than beasts. Then we have the wyvern, and this is where the confusion occurs. The wyvern is much smaller than the dragon. True dragons were often hundreds of feet long. The wyvern is comparatively wee at about 30 or 40 feet, and it only has 2 legs and 2 wings, like a bird would have. And lazy filmmakers are always confusing the two due to either not bothering to research or not being bothered to animate 2 extra legs on their dragons. But the wyvern had a sting in the end of its tail, and it was thought to spread disease and plague with it. Then another very common British dragon-like creature is the worm, related to the Scandinavian lindorm. It's essentially an immense snake. It's limbless. It has crushing coils, and its power is not in fire but in venom. It spews forth venom, and if it's hacked into pieces, those pieces can rejoin together. The basilisk and the cockatrice are very interesting creatures. They have their genesis in the Middle East, although there are stories of them here in Britain. The basilisk is a serpent that hatches from an egg that was laid by a rooster. And if a rooster lays an egg and it's incubated by a toad or a snake, a basilisk will emerge. And a basilisk is a tiny snake with a marking on its head that looks like a crown that will demonstrate that it is the king of serpents. In later stories, this crown evolves into a rooster's comb, like a cockerel would have on its head. Their breath is deadly venomous, and they were thought to have created all the deserts of the Middle East because they have a withering glance. Not only does it cause plants to wither and die and anything that it looks at to die, but it will also cause rocks to split asunder and turn into sand. The only animal that was immune to the basilisk's glare was the weasel. And a basilisk could be killed by seeing their own reflection. Was the easiest way to kill a basilisk. The cockatrice is something that evolved a little later from the basilisk. It's somewhat bigger. It looks like a sort of, if you imagine a rooster from Sellafield, you might get a good idea of what it looks like. It looks like an outsized chicken with a dragon's tail. And it shared the same powers. And it shared the same powers as the basilisk. It has this terrible glare that will kill anything that it looks at, and a venomous breath. And then from Wales, uniquely Welsh, we have this thing called the gwyber, which is essentially a flying serpent. It has no legs, but it has one pair of bat-like wings. And it was believed that if nursing mothers dropped any of their milk on the floor and a adder were to drink this milk, it would grow into a gwyber and get bigger and bigger and fiercer and grow these wings. And there's a weird association between milk and dragons in British dragon lore. The Lambton worm, to pacify it, was offered the milk of 9 cows every day. And there are other dragon legends around Britain where the creatures suck the milk from cows or were given milk to pacify them. Of course, in real life, reptiles can't digest milk. But even until relatively recently, there were stories and folklore that farmers would find adders sucking the milk of their cows. They'd attach to their cows' teats. Anyway, what makes British dragons unique and the legends of dragons in Britain unique? Well, if you think about dragon legends, you might think of a dragon on a great hoard of treasure, guarding it like Smaug in The Hobbit, who incidentally was done terribly in the film. He looked more like a plucked chicken, and they made him a wyvern. But in British dragon legends, there are very few accounts of dragon hoards. There are a few, but generally there are very, very few accounts of dragons hoarding great masses of treasure. You might think of a princess being staked out as an offering to the dragon, or virgin maids being offered to the dragon. Once again, there are a handful of cases like this in Britain, but mostly they don't exist. They're just a handful. Mostly the virgins and princesses have nothing to do with the story. A lot of times, in a lot of British dragon legends, the dragon just appears, scares the shit out of everybody, terrorises a community, and then just vanishes as quickly as it came. There's no hero that comes forth and fights it and destroys it. Lots of stories just have accounts of the dragon appearing, terrorising an area, then nicking off, which sounds very like reports of mystery animals today. Everything from the yeti to sea serpents, lake monsters, the Mongolian death worm. They appear, scare the pants off people, then disappear like they were never there. When there is a hero that comes forth to slay the beast, more often than not, it's a peasant rather than a noble. Noblemen, knights and lords do fight dragons in British dragon lore, but you're just as likely to get a sailor or a blacksmith or a tailor, anybody like that, ploughboys, who come up with good ideas for ridding the area of the dragon. And sometimes it's just a whole community that gather together to drive the dragon away. There's a legend in Ludham in Norfolk about a dragon that lived in a cave, and it would emerge from the cave, terrorise the area. And one day when it was away, all the people from the village just rolled a big boulder into the mouth of the cave. And when the dragon came back, couldn't get into the cave, it just flew away, end of story. There was no hero or great climatic battle, they just did something practical. And another thing we have, not just in Britain, but all over the world, we have an association with water. And this is something really important. We think of dragons mostly being associated with fire, because they breathe fire, but they have a closer association with water. You get stories of dragons living in caves and old mines and things like that, but mostly in Britain, they live in swamps and bogs and lakes, the sea. They come forth from wells. The green dragon of Long Whitton in Northumbria would drink from 3 holy wells. It would stick its tongue down and drink from 3 holy wells, or dip its tail into the wells to gain power. So they have this association, not just in Britain, but all over the world, with water. In China and Japan and the East, the dragon's breath condenses and forms into rain, and they have control over rainfall and tides and rivers and so forth. So keep that in mind, because that's important for later on. So, how do you slay a dragon? Well, a creature that is essentially, to all intents and purposes, a god. They're hundreds of feet long, they have impenetrable scales, they breathe fire, they often use magic or have magical powers. Dragons were supposed to have one vulnerable spot somewhere or other on their body, which was very hard to find. So what are you going to use to slay a dragon? An enchanted sword, a magical arrow like the archer in The Hobbit, or an indigestible pudding? you could use a pudding to kill a dragon. And in Filey, in Yorkshire, there was a tale of a little timid, henpecked tailor called Billy Biter, who once when he was crossing the moors fell into the lair of a dragon, and luckily he had with him some parkin, which is sort of chewy, treacly pudding that they eat up in Yorkshire. And he said to the dragon, instead of eating me, eat this parkin. So the dragon ate the parkin and let him go on the proviso he would bring back more parkin. He told this to his wife, and then his wife, who was a terrible, terrible cook, insisted on that she made a giant parkin for the dragon. So he takes the parkin back, gives it to the dragon, it sticks the dragon's teeth together. He goes and tries and clean out his teeth and his mouth in the sea, and gets overcome by the icy waves, and his whole body petrifies and becomes Filey Brig. In Lyminster in Sussex, there was a dragon called the Nooker, which lived in a pool called the Nooker Hole, and it would occasionally come out of this pool and devour people, until a local lad called Jim Puttock decided to put a stop to it by making a giant poison pie. And the pie was so big it had to have a horse and cart to pull it. And the dragon came out of the Nooker Hole, ate the pie, ate the horse and cart, and subsequently died. So, pies and puddings, a good way for fighting dragons. Spiked armour. We all know the story, or we should all know the story, of the Lambton Worm, the giant serpentine creature that terrorised Durham around the time of the First Crusades. And the story goes that Sir John Lambton went fishing on a Sunday and caught a snake-like creature in the River Wear that was only about 3 feet long, and disgusted with it, he threw it down a well. Then later on, he went off to the Crusades, and while he was away fighting the Saracens, the worm got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and finally came out of the well and started to terrorise the area, breathing poisonous gas, sucking the milk out of cows, eating livestock. And when Sir John came home, he realised he had to go and fight the worm, but everybody said, if you hack the worm in two, it will just join back together again. So a witch called Elspeth of the Glen advised him to get a blacksmith to make him armour that was studded with spikes all over like a hedgehog. And he fought the beast in the middle of the River Wear, and when it coiled around him, it impaled itself on the spikes, and he chopped it to bits, and the River Wear was so, the current was so strong that it took the bits away before they could join up. In Dalry, in Scotland, there was a similar creature called the White Worm, and this may have been the inspiration for Bram Stoker's novel Lair of the White Worm. He wrote that towards the end of his life when he was half mad with syphilis, and if you've ever read it, it makes zero sense. The film is actually much better. That's one of the rare cases of the film being actually better than the original book. But in this place in Scotland, there was this huge white serpent that coiled around a place called Moat Hill and would devour anybody that came past. So a local blacksmith made himself some spike-studded armour and actually allowed the worm to swallow him whole, like a python or an anaconda would swallow something whole. And when he was inside, he wriggled about and shredded its innards and killed it. In Herefordshire, pardon me, in Mordiford, there was a legend of a wyvern that was found by a girl called Maud. And when she found it, it was about the size of a cucumber, a little green creature. And she took it home, kept it as a pet, and fed it on milk. Again, this motif keeps reoccurring. And then it got bigger and bigger, and it graduated onto chickens, and then sheep and pigs, and finally people. Although it never attacked Maud, who found and raised it, but it terrorised the area until a local man, a murderer who was going to get hung, was given a reprieve. They said if he could slay the wyvern, he could go free. So what he did, got an empty cider barrel, I don't know if he drunk the cider first, studded it with spikes, hid inside it and goaded the creature to attack him. And when the wyvern coiled around the barrel, it impaled itself and died. Waitley in Yorkshire, one of the most famous dragon legends, the Dragon of Waitley, was slain by a knight called More of More Hall, who fought it while wearing one of these studded suits of armour. And on the night before the battle, he had a 16-year-old pale-skinned virgin brunette anoint him. Way to go. And the fight between the worm and the knight, the dragon and the knight rather, this was a true fire-breathing dragon, lasted for 2 days and 1 night. And it only ended when Moore of Moore Hall managed to kick the dragon in the one place where it wasn't armoured, which turned out to be its arsehole. The dragon was supposed to have done a great somersault and expired, having been kicked up the arse with a spiked boot. Decoys. Sometimes decoys were used to fool dragons. In Runcorn in Cheshire, there was a terrible dragon that lurked near the River Mersey, and it had devoured all the cows on either side of the Mersey for miles and miles around. And a local farmer found the remains of one of his cows and came upon a plot to try and kill the dragon. And he got the hide and the horns of the cow, and he built a wooden model of the cow that was hollow, like a miniature Trojan horse, but a cow, and hid inside it with the horns and the hide draped over it, holding a sword. The dragon came swooping down, grabbed up the cow in its talons, and he managed to open up a hatch in the side of this model and stab it with his sword in the one vulnerable spot, which was a little place underneath the wing where it was missing a scale. And the dragon crash landed on the far side of the River Mersey and expired, and apparently the hide and horns were kept in a local inn for many years afterwards. In Wales, and I will pronounce this wrong, Llandudno Groban. Christ knows how you pronounce it in Welsh. Is anybody Welsh here? Yeah. Llandeo. Yeah, what she said. Llandudno. A dragon roosted in the tower of a church and would swoop down and attack people and go out and devour livestock and humans from all around. But a local ploughboy hit upon an idea to stop it, and he carved a wooden model of another dragon, painted it red, studded it with spikes. For some reason the colour red seems to infuriate dragons, rather like bulls. He studded it with spikes and set it up on the tower while the dragon was away. When the dragon came back, it attacked the faux dragon and coiled about it, got stuck on the spikes, and both the model and the real dragon tumbled from the high spire of the church and were destroyed. Dogs. Another way of fighting dragons is with dogs. I think dogs are great. Dogs are absolutely brilliant. I love dogs. And there are many stories of dogs being used to assist in fighting dragons. In West Calden in Surrey, a soldier who was a deserter, and once again he was said, like, they said to him, the authorities caught him and said, we'll either hang you or you can go and fight this dragon, because he was a deserter. Took his dog to fight a dragon and managed to get the dog to distract the dragon long enough for him to plunge his sword into the dragon's vulnerable spot. Bisterne in Hampshire, Sir Maurice de Berkeley fought a dragon he covered his armour in birdlime and ground glass to protect himself from the fire, and he's accompanied by 2 mastiffs, but unfortunately both the dogs and the knight were killed by the dragon. In Yorkshire, there are 3 stories that are geographically very close to each other and so similar that they must have had one root legend. And the basic story is that a worm is terrorising the area, and a hero comes forward and fights the worm, but the worm can rejoin when he slices it with his sword, joins back together. So he takes a trained dog with him, and each time he hacks a piece off the worm, the dog grabs the chunk of flesh, runs away with it a mile away and drops it so it can't rejoin to the coils of the worm until eventually the worm is hacked to pieces. And then the dog jumps up and licks its master's face, whereupon both the hero and the dog die from the venomous blood of the worm. And in Loxley Hill, it's Sir Peter Loxley. At Slingsby, it's Sir William Wivell. And at Kellington, it's a commoner. It's a shepherd called Ormroyd. And Orm is an old name for dragon. Mirrors and mirrored armour. I mean, we talked earlier about basilisks and cockatrices. One of the few things that can destroy them is the sight of their own reflection, because their gaze is as deadly to them as anything else. So mirrors and mirrored armour have been used to fight these creatures and other types of dragon as well. In Wherwell, in Hampshire, a cockatrice haunted the priory, killing everybody around with its terrible breath and its glare, until a mirror made out of polished steel was lowered into the cellar where the creature lived, and its own reflection killed it. And there are a number of stories like this, in particularly from Poland. In Prague, there was a basilisk living in the cellar of a house, and people that went down there all died from its terrible breath. And one man went in holding a huge mirror and killed the creature and brought it out, and it was just a tiny snake with a crown-like marking on its head. In Exeter, where I live, there's a pub called the White Hart, and there's outside of it there's a well that in the 1650s a basilisk was supposed to have inhabited, and its poisonous breath was coming out and killing people, and anybody that went down into the well were killed by the venom. And I've always thought maybe this was some sort of underground leak of gas, some natural gas coming up from where they dug the well. Oh God, we've got another bleeding Welsh one here. Right. P-E-N-M-Y-N-Y-D-D. P-E-N-M-Y-N-Y-D-D. Yeah, that place there. There's a legend about a noble family, and when a son is born to this family, a soothsayer appears at the party when they're celebrating the birth of this child, and he said this child will die by the bite of a gwyber, which is the winged serpent they have in Wales. So they send the boy away to England where there are no gwybers, and a gwyber appears and starts terrorising the area. So a local man watches its movements, and he sees that it always slithers down a certain track when it comes out of its cave. So he digs a pit in the track, puts a highly polished bronze mirror into the pit, covers the pit over. The creature comes slithering along, falls into the pit, sees its own reflection, thinks it's a rival, and starts to bite and slash with its fangs at the bronze mirror until it's exhausted, and then the lad jumps down and manages to hack its head off. So the lad's given a huge reward, and they keep the skull of the gwyber as a memento of this great battle, and it's kept at the house of this noble family. And when the boy is brought back from England, he looks at the gwyber's skull and scoffs at the whole idea of him being killed by a gwyber and kicks it in contempt, and one of its fangs goes through his boot and it's got some residual poison on it, and it kills him. Serves him right. At Horndon in Essex, Sir James Tyrrell manages to slay a dragon by just polishing his armour so much that it dazzles the creature when it's trying to eat him, and he can stab it in its vulnerable spot whilst his polished armour has dazzled it. Saffron Walden in Essex, a basilisk that's supposed to be terrorising the area, until a knight covers his armour in crystal glass, and once again the sight of its own reflection makes the animal expire. Perhaps the most interesting way of defeating a dragon is by exploiting its own greed. And there's a great story, from the island of Mull. And the island was supposed to be terrorised by a dragon that had its lair in a cave, and anybody that went to fight it was killed. Their swords and lances shattered on its armour, they were torn apart by its jaws and claws, or turned to ashes by its fire. And then one man hits upon an idea, and he anchors his ship in a local lock, and then from the ship to the shore he constructs a sort of walkway or bridge made out of floating barrels lashed together, which he drives iron spikes through. Then he rounds up a herd of cows and ushers them up to the dragon's cave. And when the dragon emerges, he slaughters one of the cows, and the dragon goes for the cow and eats it. And then he's ushering the other cows back down towards his ship. And whenever the dragon gets close, he kills another cow. The dragon stops and eats the cow. He'll go a bit further, slaughter another cow. The dragon eats the cow. And finally, they get down to the beach where of the lock where his ship is anchored. This is a sea lock, not a landlocked lock. And the last cow is slaughtered on the beach, and the dragon eats the last cow, and then the man runs across the bridge of spiked barrels to his ship, and the dragon by now is so fat and bloated with cow flesh that it can't fly, it's too heavy to fly. So it crawls after him, and it's so heavy and fat that it impales itself on the spikes and dies on the bridge due to its own weight forcing the spikes through its scales. And there's an almost identical story from another one of the Hebridean islands, but in this case it's a Viking that comes up with a plot, and instead of using cows he uses horses. So those are some of the ways you can defeat dragons. So it's very rarely in British dragon lore, it's very rarely a straight fight. There's some sort of trick involved by the dragon slayer who exploits some sort of foible of the dragon's nature to defeat it. And as I said, it's more than likely to be a peasant rather than a knight or a nobleman. So what were they? I mean, I went into detail over this in my talk last year, and of the various theories that are behind dragon lore. And one thing that I reject is that they're purely metaphors, or they're allegories for something else. If you look at dragon legends worldwide, you'll see that people are talking about experiences that they had. Now, in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, there are numerous accounts of dragons being seen, and these are not meteors or comets or any kind of meteorological or astrological phenomenon. They are actual dragons, and they're described as, some of them flying over Lindisfarne, and described as having great bat-like wings and nostrils that reminded them, the people who saw them, of the snout of a pig. And there are numerous accounts of these creatures in historical records, not just from Britain, but from all over the world. So one theory is that they're exotic reptiles that were brought to Britain and escaped, and because the local people didn't know what they were, they morphed into some sort of monster in the retelling. At Burrs and Wormingford in Sussex in 1805, a dragon was said to be dwelling in the marshes, and it was described as having armoured skin, and if people shot at it with arrows or spears, they would bounce back off its hard skin. They don't mention wings or fiery breath, but they said it had a long tail and great jaws full of teeth, and it devoured both men and animals. And it disappeared into the marshes as the weather got colder and was never seen again. That sounds very much like a crocodile. Now, it may surprise you that early menageries like the Royal Menagerie at the Tower of London had all sorts of exotic animals, lions, tigers, bears, snakes, crocodiles, that were brought back from the Middle East and Africa and parts of India. The history of zoos is a fascinating subject in itself. I used to be a zookeeper, and the history of zoos in Britain is fascinating, and I could do a whole talk on that. But it seems probable that this Sussex dragon that lived in the marsh was a crocodile that had been brought back from overseas, and of course in winter it would have died of cold. This is a tropical animal, it can't survive in the winter, but crocodiles are truly formidable animals. The largest of them can approach 30 feet in length and 3 tons in weight. They have a bite something like 3 times more powerful than a great white shark, and they will take down water buffalo, tigers, lions, leopards, even sharks, and they're notorious man-eaters. So if you can imagine a peasant who's never seen anything more formidable than an adder coming across a crocodile in the marshes, it would make for quite a scary encounter. In 1614 at St Leonard's Forest in Sussex, a pamphlet was circulated telling people about a small dragon that was haunting the area, and it was said to be about 9 feet long, black on top with reddish markings, and was sort of spindle shaped, thin at one end, then sort of fatter in the middle, and then thin again at the other. And it said whenever it heard men or cattle approaching it, it would rear up its head and look around in a most arrogant manner, and it would kill men and dogs by casting forth poison, but not eat them. And it survived off conies, which is the old name for rabbits, in a local warren. That sounds very like a cobra to me. When a cobra is rearing up in a threat posture and looking around, if you'd never seen it before, you can imagine it being sort of haughty and pompously looking around, a bit like a Tory looking at poor people, or blacks or disabled people, or any of these other social undesirables. Ew, look at you. Like that. You could imagine that. It would have this arrogant look, and it casts forth its venom. Some species of cobra spit their venom at the eyes of their victims. The bump in the middle, the spindle shape, is almost certainly, people have seen it when it's eaten a rabbit, and if you've ever seen a snake that's eaten a large prey item, they have this big bulge in the middle before they digest it. And of course, come winter, it would have died off because of the cold, but even if it was only there for a few months, it would have caused extreme terror. There was a theory put forward in 1979 by a guy called Peter Dickinson, and it's a fascinating book called The Flight of Dragons. It's been reprinted a couple of years ago, so you could probably pick it up on Amazon quite easily. And he postulated that dragons were actually the descendants of flesh-eating dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus rex, and that they flew and breathed fire by manipulation of hydrogen gas in the stomach, and that essentially they were like living hot air balloons. The wings were actually an extended rib cage covered with skin that were only used for steering and manoeuvring. The actual lift was from this great belly the dragon had that it filled with gas, which it created from the acids in its stomach with the calcium of its victims, the bones of its victims which it ate. And by a chemical catalyst, it could control this by spitting out fire, so it would extend its body, the gas in its body, to fly, and then when it wanted to come down again, it would burn it off rather like a hot air balloon. And of course, the fire was a secondary use was as a weapon. It's a fascinating theory, if ultimately unprovable. One of the most interesting ideas is that dragons are actually, for want of a better word, supernatural creatures, paranormal. They're not flesh and blood in the way that we understand it. And I study all kinds of monsters all over the world, and the vast majority of them are real in the sense that you and I are real. Things like the Tasmanian wolf and the Mongolian deathworm and things like that are probably flesh and blood animals that you could catch and put on display at a zoo. The giant anaconda is a real animal, things like that. The yeti is almost certainly a real animal, the orang pendek. But there are other things that are much weirder, much stranger, that seem to behave in a very odd way, that appear in places that couldn't support them and seem to appear and disappear very quickly. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of dragon legends in Britain, these things appear, terrorise an area, and then disappear like they'd never existed. And a lot of modern day monster sightings are like that. And looking into these, you find what I call the global monster template. It's kind of a menagerie of archetypes that you will find in every culture. Every culture on Earth has dragons or dragon analogues, huge frightening reptiles. Every culture on Earth has stories of hairy giants, call them trolls in medieval Europe, Bigfoot in North America, the Almasty in Russia, all of these creatures, big hairy man-like things. Then you have stories of little people, goblins, gnomes, things like that. Once again, in every culture. Duende in Latin American countries, the little people are called the duende. You have stories of giant birds, griffins, rocks, thunderbirds, all over the world. You have stories of monstrous dogs, not just werewolves and demonic black dogs in Britain, but you have all sorts of strange dog-like animals in cultures all over the world, from Japan to Australia. And then you have monstrous cats, demonic, strange, supernatural cats. And these things are repeated over and over again in every culture. And it struck me, hang on a minute, I remember where I was when I came up with this theory. I was sitting in a sculpture park in Thailand and looking at their sculptures of their gods and creatures, and they had the Naga, this great serpentine beast, and Hanuman, which was the monkey god, and the Garuda, the bird-like creature they have over there. And they're all analogues of creatures that would have scared us about 2 or 3 million years ago, when our ancestors were running around on the plains of Africa. We'd have been preyed on by crocodiles and pythons. Big eagles like the Marshall eagle would have taken us down. There would have been wild dogs, big cats that would have attacked us, and we would have been in competition with other primates, some larger, some smaller. So it's almost as if these primal terrors have survived as a fossil memory within our genes, and they're somehow handed down from generation to generation over thousands and thousands of years. So we keep this menagerie of strange creatures. Now, there's a guy called F.W. Holliday, or Ted Holliday. He wrote a great book called The Dragon and the Disc, long out of print, but you can find it online. And he thought that lake monsters that are seen today, lake and sea monsters like the Loch Ness Monster and others, are literally dragons because of this association with water. And he believed that they were supernatural and utterly malevolent. And he looks at the fear that some of these things engender. In 1954, Georgina Carberry, with some friends, was fishing at Loch Fada in Connemara when they encountered a serpentine beast throwing itself into great loops in the water with shark-like jaws. And they escaped onto shore double time, and Carberry says she had this horrible feeling that somehow it had left the loch and pursued them. There was a feeling of pursuit even when they were miles away from the loch, and she had terrible nightmares for years afterwards and would never return. And Holliday interviewed her, and she was still terrified of this thing she'd seen years ago. George Spicer and his wife in 1933 saw a 30-foot creature slithering across the road in front of their car as they were driving near Loch Ness. He likened it to a huge snail without a shell, but with a great long neck. He called it an absolute abomination. He called for the loch to be dynamited and admitted that it terrified him. Greta Finlay, 1954, fishing with her son, saw the creature with a great grey neck, rough skin, short horns. She was utterly, utterly terrified, gave up fishing. 1974, Mr. Richard Jenkins saw the creature writhing around in the water. He estimated it to be 60 feet long. He was watching it from his house by the loch side. He said it reminded him of a great stomach with a length of intestine attached to it, which was actually the neck. And his actual words were, "I felt the beast was obscene. The feeling of obscenity persists." Now, the Reverend Dr. Donald Ormond was one of the world's leading exorcists, And he tackled cases like supposed possession by vampires, demonic dogs, all sorts of things. And in 1976, he tried to exorcise Loch Ness. He had an encounter with a sea serpent along a Norwegian fjord in the early 70s, which terrified him, and the captain of the ship that he was in told him that this beast is not a normal flesh and blood serpent, but it's akin to the serpent in the Garden of Eden. It's an ancient evil spirit. So the Reverend Dr. Donald Orman tried to exorcise Loch Ness, and he mapped out a cross over Loch Ness and exorcised it, all the stations of the cross and the middle. Obviously it failed. But we should note that Aleister Crowley once had a house near Loch Ness, Beliskin House, and he was trying to carry out a ritual called the Ritual of Abramelin the Mage, which took a very long time and needed certain architecture to finish it. And it was supposed to bring down a guardian angel that would give you great magical secrets. During this ritual, you are supposed to summon and bind the 12 Dukes of Hell, which include Leviathan, which is a great Hebrew dragon that lives in the sea. The ritual went wrong. A lot of his servants went mad. One tried to kill him. Another one murdered his own wife and children. Another one of his servants. Crowley left the area. It was a complete disaster. And he believed that something dark had been released there. I think it's about time for me to finish. I could go on about this case. Jimmy Page owned Beliskin House afterwards. And his man he left to look after the house said there were poltergeist activity there. There was some great beast slithering around, and even today there are sightings of this creature in Loch Ness. Rather than a plesiosaur or a giant eel, it just might be some supernatural creature awakened by Aleister Crowley, and he's fiddling about with the Ritual of Abramelin the Mage. But I could talk some more, but I think we've got to knock it on the head.